one of the world's largest banks, 2 deadly drug cartels, and nearly $900 million in dirty money from the drug trade. For years, the ruthless Sinaloa and Norte del Valle cartels relied on global banking giant HSBC to move massive amounts of drug money. How did a respected bank become a financial partner for organized crime? Imagine that you're running one of the world's most profitable illegal businesses. Every single day, you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug sales across the United States. But there's a massive problem. All of that money is in cash, literal mountains of crumpled 20s and hundreds piling up from street-level drug dealers. In the early 2000s, the powerful Sinaloa and Norte del Valle cartels were all but drowning in physical cash. Unfortunately, you can't buy a Mercedes with a stack of 20s, and the cartels knew that US banks had sophisticated regulations and protections in place that would quickly flag any suspicious big money deposits. They couldn't spend it, they couldn't bank it, but they could ship it. So part 1 of turning too much cash into usable money involved smuggling truckloads of US dollars across the border into Mexico just to deal with the sheer volume. To pull off part 2 of the scheme, the cartels were going to need some outside help. In any money laundering scheme, placement means getting the dirty money into the banking system. For that, the cartels knew just where to go. Mexican banks weren't subject to the same regulatory safety net as their US counterparts, and the cartels found the Mexican branches of HSBC to be a particularly welcoming environment. These bank branches became the entry point for cartel cash. To make it easier to deposit large sums of cash quickly, the cartels designed their own custom cash boxes that fit perfectly into HSBC teller windows. How convenient! Now they could deposit hundreds of thousands in cash every single day. HSBC Mexico would take care of the rest, wiring that same money back to bank accounts in New York and financial capitals around the world. This wasn't just moving money, it was transforming it. What started as dirty street cash became clean, legitimate-looking international wire transfers in the global financial system. Instead of trying to spend suspicious piles of cash, the cartels now had proper bank transfers they could use to buy luxury goods or more weapons to sustain their deadly businesses. But surely once that money hit HSBC Bank USA, alarms would go off. Wouldn't they? It turns out that HSBC had made an interesting choice, one that the cartels exploited to perfection. Instead of treating Mexico as a high-risk country for money laundering, HSBC classified it as standard risk. This reduced oversight and let massive sums of cartel money pass through with minimal scrutiny. This is part of what's known as layering, hiding the original source of the money through a myriad of overlapping transactions. And with that, the scheme was now complete. The cartels could move cash from street-level drug sales to international accounts in just a few steps, slicing and stacking the profits to obscure the source, with the bank's own infrastructure smoothing the way. For the bank, this was a symptom of a larger problem. Between 2006 and 2010, HSBC Bank USA failed to monitor over $200 trillion in global wire transfers, including $670 billion that originated from HSBC Mexico. Within these complex flows, at least $881 million in drug proceeds were laundered into the US financial system. The sheer scale makes it clear how easily illicit funds could blend into legitimate transactions. So, how could HSBC have let itself be exploited by these ruthless organizations? How did they fail to see what was going on? The shocking truth is, the bank knew exactly what it was doing. Even the people working at the bank's counters understood what was going on. Compliance reports noted that deposits were so large and frequent that tellers joked they could smell cartel involvement. It was a regular part of the bank's day-to-day operations. Senior compliance officers repeatedly warned leadership about the risks, pushing for account closures and stricter monitoring. Warnings were also coming from outside the organization. Both Mexican regulators and US law enforcement flagged HSBC Mexico for large, unusual transactions and frequent bulk cash deposits. In 2008, Mexican law enforcement went so far as to provide HSBC Mexico's CEO with recordings of a drug lord naming HSBC as the cartel's preferred bank for laundering money. The Sinaloa Cartel alone moved over $1.1 billion through HSBC Mexico branches in just 2 years. Staff were desperately trying to get the bank to take action. The authorities were flagging a pattern of abuse, and the cartels were literally laughing all the way to the bank. HSBC's strategy was simple: ignore the warnings and leverage HSBC's internal culture to discourage staff from raising concerns. But dig a little deeper, and you discover that HSBC wasn't simply turning a blind eye. In fact, HSBC's executives made strategic choices that increased risk. In addition to downgrading Mexico's risk score internally, the bank methodically sabotaged its own compliance regime. HSBC's anti-money laundering department was critically understaffed by design. Vacancies were left unfilled. By 2007, the bank had fewer AML staff than its own internal plan required, sometimes leaving just a handful of officers to monitor suspicious activity. This was billed as a cost-saving measure. Leadership interference went well beyond keeping staff lean. Risky clients were consistently rubber-stamped and compliance warnings dismissed. One compliance officer described the situation bluntly, saying the team needed real backbone to stand up to business leaders who prioritized profits over rules. HSBC's Cayman Islands operation highlighted the corporate attitude. By 2008, the branch managed over 35,000 accounts, of which fully 2,200 were high-risk accounts containing $25 million in suspicious funds. The concentration of high-risk, under-monitored accounts in an offshore environment created a vulnerability that criminals gleefully exploited. But the exploitation didn't end on the balance sheet. The consequences of HSBC's collusion were not hypothetical. Drug cartel money that flowed through HSBC helped fund violence, corruption, and instability across Mexico and beyond. The bank's failures enabled criminal organizations to expand their reach, pay bribes, and buy weapons. The bank was facilitating crime, as it stifled its internal watchdogs and ignored warnings from the authorities. But why? Between 2006 and 2010, HSBC Bank USA processed over $200 trillion in wire transfers with virtually no monitoring, opening the door to at least $881 million in cartel proceeds. The fees for facilitating those transactions were in the billions. Executives said openly that closing high-risk accounts would damage key client relationships. The bank's leadership weighed the potential costs of compliance against the immediate gains from keeping high-margin clients, and for years, profit won out. For HSBC, the financial incentives were too great to risk upsetting the status quo. Any push for stricter enforcement was seen as a threat to the business model itself. When U.S. authorities finally intervened, the scale of these failures became impossible to ignore. HSBC's egregious compliance breakdown and its long-term support of criminal enterprise was fully exposed. In 2012, HSBC faced a historic reckoning, a $1.9 billion penalty for its role in laundering money for Mexican drug cartels and violating U.S. sanctions. Of that sum, just $1.256 billion was criminal forfeiture. The remainder, civil penalties, divided among the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, and the New York District Attorney. It was the largest fine that had ever been imposed on a bank for failing to combat money laundering. For an institution like HSBC, the impact of $1.9 billion in fines was surprisingly limited. At that time, HSBC's annual profit topped $50 billion. Thus, the fine represented a mere 5 weeks of earnings, and rather than face trial, HSBC entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. This meant the bank could avoid a criminal conviction, provided it cooperated with authorities and implemented a series of reforms. With the amount of evidence at their disposal, why did prosecutors choose to settle? The answer, they said, came down to the sheer size and influence of HSBC. Regulators feared that a criminal conviction could destabilize a financial system that processes trillions of dollars every day. In their view, the risk of triggering a global banking crisis outweighed the benefits of a conviction. This approach was intended to hold HSBC accountable without putting the wider economy at risk. The decision sparked outrage. Lawmakers, financial experts, and the public questioned whether justice had been served. With HSBC's profits dwarfing the fine, many saw the penalty as little more than a cost of doing business. The message was clear. If a bank is big enough, it can break the rules. If it gets caught, it simply pays a fine and moves on, while those ravaged by the drug trade continued to suffer. Not a single senior officer was criminally charged. The executives kept their jobs, their reputations, and their massive bonuses. This fueled further outrage and led to tough questions about fairness and accountability. HSBC's public response did little to ease criticism. The bank promised to overhaul its anti-money laundering systems and hire more compliance staff. For many observers, these promises felt like too little too late. The HSBC affair unfolded in the wake of 2008's subprime financial market fiasco, another scandal rooted in the failure of firms and regulators to follow the rules designed to keep the system stable. It was a reminder that financial institutions can fail with catastrophic consequences. If companies won't follow their own ethics regimes, and if regulators refuse to apply the law to its fullest extent, what will be the cost when the next bank runs afoul of the rules, and who will pay the price? Financial institutions have responsibilities that go far beyond legal compliance and the balance sheet. The fallout of the HSBC scandal reached far beyond the bank's balance sheet, with the victims numbering the millions. Once a firm starts to put profit before principle, the negative consequences multiply. Your success and your reputation depend on a solid ethical foundation. What's your take on HSBC's conduct? Do you consider ethical safeguards optional checkboxes or foundations for lasting success?